Welcome to part 2 of this 2-part mini-series on cult psychology, where we're going to look at the broader epistemic applications of the lessons that we explored in part 1. What I want to really focus in on in part 2 is that cult dynamics are everywhere in modern society and also throughout all of human history, if you just take a look. So usually when we say the word cult, people think, oh, he's talking about Scientology or Jonestown or the Moonies or Jehovah's Witnesses or some crazy, outlandish, fringe conspiracy theorist groups out there that believe crazy things and do crazy things that have nothing to do with me and have nothing to do with my organization, nothing to do with my business, nothing to do with my religion, nothing to do with my sports team or anything like that. But you probably don't think of, when I say the word cult, Buddhism, yoga, science, self-help, atheism, rationalism, materialism, capitalism, Wall Street, academia, politics, libertarians, pickup, corporations, consumerism, marketing, mainstream media, mainstream norms and culture, ethics, morality, abortion, fashion, language, psychotherapy, YouTube channels, Twitter, Facebook, medicine, family, abusive relationships, homophobia, the church, whatever church you belong to, the military, sports. Yet all of these areas of life are infested with cult dynamics. And so while in part 1 of this mini-series, what I wanted to focus on was sort of drawing a sharp distinction between a cult and not a cult. And that can be very useful. It can be very useful to have a strict technical definition of a cult, which I gave you in part 1, so that you can really evaluate when a group is a hardcore cult. But now we're sort of shifting almost to the polar opposite, and now we're going to look at cults not in this binary yes or no sort of way, like you look at an organization, you ask the question, is that organization a cult? And you just say yes or no. Rather than looking at it like that, now let's evaluate it in shades of gray, in degrees of cult-like behavior. And now let's really break down what it means to be a cult into subcomponents. Because the label cult, it's like this one monolithic label which stands in for a lot of stuff. It's rather abstract. And there's a lot of subcomponents to it. And so while most organizations in mainstream society would not be classified technically as a cult, if you're going to pose the sort of binary yes or no question to it, they will still exhibit a lot of the subcomponents. And that can be extremely useful to see. So what I want you to start to see is that there's no clear boundary between where a cult ends and where mainstream society begins. And that in fact, most cults are just offshoots from mainstream society. And that really it's a difference of degree, not in kind. And yet, while we're going to be considering this, differences in degrees here today, I still want you to retain the old lens of looking at cults as this binary yes or no thing, using that strict technical definition that I gave you. Still retain that. You're going to be using both of these lenses simultaneously as you're going to be analyzing and looking around the world. And also, of course, looking at your own life and looking at all the groups that you are a member of and how cult-like they might be. Really, cults are not a new phenomenon. Cult behavior, cult dynamics have existed, I would guess, for at least 300,000 years. Modern Homo sapiens, recent discoveries are showing, have been dated back to 350,000 years. That's modern Homo sapiens. That means they probably had very similar brain wiring and very similar psychological mechanisms, which drove their behaviors. So it's very hard for me to imagine that 350,000 years ago, there weren't cults. There were, and the original cults are basically just tribes. And you can still find them in underdeveloped parts of the world, in Indonesia, in the Amazon, in Africa. You can still find tribal people that live in small groups of 150 or something people. And basically, what are these groups? They're cults. They have their own little cultures, their own little sets of norms, their own in-group and out-group, and all the stuff that comes with that. And they're very defensive about their rituals, their religious customs, their culture, their language, their way of doing things. You know how many dialects of language there are in the world? Not just a couple hundred. There's thousands of them, thousands of different dialects of different kinds of languages. Some languages are so small and so remote that you've never even heard of them. They're not even written about in books, but they exist within these little tribes. Literally, a little tribe will develop its own language over time. And of course, what is modern society but just a bigger version of that? We've scaled it up into the millions and billions, but modern nations are really just like large tribes. You can look at them that way. Now, of course, there are important differences, but it's an interesting way to look at it. And also, every major religion, regardless of what it is basically itself a cult at some point in its history, and it's an offshoot off of something else. And every major religion has its own cults that shoot off from it. So the Jews might consider Christianity a cult, and then the Christians might consider Mormonism a cult, and then the Mormons will consider fringe fundamentalist Mormon groups also a cult, straying away from mainstream Mormonism. See, and there's no end to it. Reality is always splintering itself off like that, and that's what people are doing. That's how collective ego works. One of the trickeries with the word cult is that in the mainstream usage of this word, there's a common mainstream mistake that's made, which is to think that, well, if I'm not part of some fringe ideological group, if I'm not in a cult, that means I'm safe. That means the things that I believe and my views of reality are basically true and correct. And that's not at all the case. Not at all the case. Because what you're doing there is you're judging the validity of your beliefs and worldview based sort of on majority rule of opinion. It's like whatever the majority opinion is, that's like the correct way to look at the world. And if you live in a modern European-style developed country like in America or somewhere in Europe, then chances are that you're completely bought into this illusion that somehow mainstream Western civilization has the correct perspective on the world. And that by sticking to that perspective, you're somehow safe. You're somehow safe by sticking to science, or you're somehow safe by sticking with atheism because you're not going to get sucked into some radical ideology. Not at all. You can get completely deluded by mainstream thinking. Now, of course, there's sort of a double-edged thing going on here with this point, because at the same time, I also want to say you should appreciate that mainstream culture and society does, in a sense, protect you from extreme and dangerous ideologies and ideas. It does have a sort of moderating influence. And that is because it's gone through a long evolutionary period of trial and error where a lot of radical ideas were weeded out, ideas that would get you killed, ideas that would destroy society. Those were weeded out through revolutions and bloody wars and through torture, imprisonment, and criminal trials and protest movements and civil rights movements and democratic votes. And this has been going on for thousands of years. Society has been evolving. So in a certain sense, mainstream society is evolved. It's much more evolved than if you go to some African tribe and look at what they're doing there. They can believe some really crazy stuff. But that still doesn't protect you, and that still doesn't mean that your mainstream views of the world and of reality are correct. In fact, they're wrong. Mostly everything that mainstream society teaches you from a metaphysics standpoint, from a truth standpoint, is wrong. Because what culture is this sort of reality bubble that we're creating collectively together to help us to survive. It doesn't care about the truth. It cares about helping you to survive. And those are two very different things that you have to distinguish. Living in these reality bubbles that we create, really, it's better to call them fantasy bubbles, is what human beings do. It's sort of like our distinguishing feature among the animal kingdom is that we create these fantasy bubbles in which we live. And there's so many different kinds of these fantasy or reality bubbles that you can create, way more than you would think. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of different kinds. So the trick is figuring out which one of them is correct, which one of them is going to lead to productive living which ones are going to lead to craziness, calamity, suffering, and suicide and torture and other sorts of things like this. And then how do you get to the truth? See, most people, what they do is they get stuck in their own bubble and they think that that's what the truth is. And it never even occurs to them that the truth could be a meta thing. Maybe the truth is not one of these bubbles at all. So it's not a matter of finding the right bubble. It's actually about seeing the entire meta dynamic of how the mind creates these bubbles and why it creates these bubbles and why these bubbles are so addictive and why it's so difficult to step outside of bubbles and to take a sort of meta perspective, the view from outside the bubble and what that might be, So what happens is that most human beings live inside these bubbles. It's very difficult for us to see the world outside of our bubble. And then we tend to reinforce our own bubble because we need that bubble to help us to live and to survive. It's literally a matter of life and death. It's not just a matter of like, oh yeah, that idea is cool. I would like to believe this thing there. Oh, that sounds like a nice theory. No. It's like your entire life is predicated upon surviving within one of these bubbles. And so you're going to now reinforce that bubble compulsively and pathologically. And your own clinging to your bubble is then going to create all of your suffering and misery pretty much in your life. And you're not going to know that because you're going to mistake your bubble for reality. So this is the larger dynamic that we're working with here. These are epistemic dynamics, dynamics about human knowledge and how do we know anything in the world? How do we know what reality is? How do we know what we can trust? How do we know we can trust science? How do we know we can trust atheism or Mormonism or Buddhism or anything for that matter? How do you know you can trust anything that I say? Everything I say applies reflexively on everything that I say. So I'm not creating a sort of a special privileged zone for me and my actualized philosophy as though it's somehow immune from all these factors. No. It's extremely susceptible to all this. So you got to keep that in mind. But anyways, I don't want to digress too much on that. Let's talk about the various subcomponents that we see commonly throughout mainstream society that is cult-like. And perhaps the most important one to stress here, the defining characteristics of cult-like behavior, is stereotyping, judging, and devaluing outsiders. This is like the epitome of cult dynamics. And there's a lot of subcomponents to this one subcomponent. So let's cover the subcomponents of this one subcomponent. So if you notice, when human beings come together in a group, we tend to develop a sort of a herd mentality. And we start to stereotype and judge and devalue outsiders. And this stereotyping and judging and devaluation becomes very addictive. And it takes on a life of its own. It takes on a reality of its own. There's always an in-group and an out-group that's created. Us versus them. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. And once that dynamic or duality is created, then a lot gets built around that to reinforce that and make it seem very real until people buy into it. And you can notice in your own life how you've done this with other races, with other countries, with other languages, with people who look different than you, speak different than you. I mean, this is found everywhere throughout human history, and it's not just something that existed 50 years ago with your grandparents. No, it exists right now today. You're seeing it in the news every single day. Oversimplifying the other group and then demonizing them and creating this sort of polarity and then blaming them and scapegoating them for all of the problems that you have in life. And that becomes very convenient because anything that I'm creating in my life, I can just offload onto some other group out there. A different religion, a different racial group, a different gender, a different political orientation that people have. You're doing this all the time. And all of your teachers and mentors are also doing this. And then what happens is that judgment and that stereotyping, that oversimplifying the other becomes contagious. For example, I don't know if you've noticed this, but take a look into your history, your personal history when you were a child or a teenager. Notice, were your parents very judgmental of somebody, some group of people, some religious people or some scientific people or whatever, some political party, some racial group? What you'll notice is that if they were judgmental about something, you then very likely caught, like a virus, you caught that contagion of judgment. And now it's very difficult for you to stop judging in the same way that your parents judged. Because when an authority figure or somebody that you love or somebody that you look up to or someone that you're a friend with judges something, you tend to try to align with that, usually. So notice that. I remember my dad, this is kind of a funny example. He wasn't racist or anything, but he would judge Chevrolet. He would always make fun of Chevy cars. Like they would have Chevy commercials, and on the TV, that their slogan, Chevy's slogan used to be "like a rock." That was their slogan. And then for us, it became sort of like a joke because we thought that Chevys were kind of ugly looking, like clunkers compared to other cars like Toyotas and stuff. And so we would always kind of like when we were driving, remember we would go on long road trips up Northern California and into Oregon. He was doing work and I was on the road with him. And we would just, talk and stuff. But since we were driving, we were pointing at cars a lot, talking about different cars that we saw, new models of cars. And so it was kind of like between him and me, there would be this kind of like in joke of like, oh, look at that. It's like a rock, this ugly looking Chevy. But see, I adopted that. I didn't realize it at the time, but I got infected with that to the point where like I would become judgmental of Chevys. And then like later in my life, in my early 20s, I would see a Chevy and then Chevy like improved their line of products and they started putting out nicer looking cars, but I would still have that judgment. And then I realized, oh my God, this is exactly how racism works. This is exactly how it works. This is what we mean by this kind of stereotyping, judging, and devaluing some other group out there. And it really doesn't matter what it is. It could even be cars. It could be Apple products. It could be Windows or it could be Xbox or PlayStation. You could be doing this with your friends and you don't even know you're doing it. As part of this dynamic, also what you do is you ascribe bad motives to others. You tend to view others as evil and selfish. And as like sometimes when you create this rift, you can create the rift so large that you look at that other group and you say, I don't even understand those people. They're insane. They're crazy. They're so evil. How could they be so evil in their actions? And the reason you can't understand is precisely because you've already created this rift. And you've oversimplified and overstereotyped them as a group because that's a gross abstraction that you're creating. That group doesn't really exist. Whatever you believe about black people or Asians or Jews or Christians or Mormons, like this is complete fantasy. There is no such thing as Mormons or Christians or Jews or black people. I mean, these are constructions of your mind, really. Now, don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean that their skin color changes. The skin color is there. But what you believe about it and the stereotypes you create and the kind of stories you tell around that, that's what you're constructing. Also, another component that comes with this is ridiculing and humiliating that other group. Because you can't take their perspective on life seriously. They have to be ridiculed and humiliated, which is why you see a lot of this, for example, on YouTube. Have you seen these videos on YouTube which try to be controversial? A lot of these political videos where it's like, conservative eviscerates social justice warrior feminist and makes her cry, humiliates and ridicules. And like, that's the whole, like, it's so juvenile the way that a lot of politics on YouTube is done. It really is just ridicule and humiliation without really trying to get at the other person's perspective, trying to understand why is there this difference between us? What am I not seeing that maybe they're seeing? How did life shape their experiences differently? And why is their worldview different than mine? Could it be because they've had a different upbringing? Maybe they know something that I don't know. Right? None of this none of this happens when you ridicule and humiliate the other side. So you see a lot of belittling of other perspectives and straw manning. A lot of what the mind does is, rather than doing the hard labor, the emotional work and the intellectual work of going through somebody else's arguments and looking through that perspective and kind of trying to understand, why does a person see the world that way? Rather than doing that, the perspective is just strawmanned. It's grossly oversimplified to the point where then it becomes very easy to ridicule and to humiliate it. And then by doing that, you don't have to seriously consider it. And therefore, you can't really learn anything from it. And then that gap is growing larger and larger and larger. And then at that point, once you've strawmanned the hell out of somebody's perspective, then all that's left to do is just to call them crazy, or to call them hysterical, or to call them evil or deluded. Another aspect of this sort of stereotyping is the use of cliche pejoratives. And we talked about this in part 1 of this miniseries, where I talked about how cults will create their own jargon, their own language, just like tribes do. They create their own language. And of course, the labels that are used are often stereotypical and grossly oversimplified abstractions, which are baked in with the various prejudices and judgments and demonizations that the tribe holds. So, for example, a really good example of this is the pejorative cliche axis of evil that was used by George W. Bush in one of his speeches back in the 2000s, and it was coined by David Frum, conservative speechwriter David Frum. And this was so interesting to me, this idea of the axis of evil. I remember when I heard this, like it made no sense to me. The axis of evil. Like, how self-righteous and arrogant do you have to be to lump 3 completely unrelated countries together? It was this label referred to Iran, Iraq, and I believe North Korea. And it's sort of like you simplistically lump these different countries with completely different histories, different ideologies, different religions. You lump them all together and you call them evil. Like, how self-serving it is to do that, and then to actually come up there and to think that you have some sophisticated analysis of the world. You have some sophisticated understanding of geopolitics by using this label of axis of evil. And yet, as silly as that sounds, we do this all the time in mainstream culture. Here's a few examples. The label socialism is a very loaded label. There's a lot of pejorative negativity assigned to that label. And a lot of times, especially in America, for example, conservatives will use that label socialism, and as soon as they hear that word, like in their mind, it's just like it triggers just sort of a knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, okay, that's just nonsense, and it's just stupid, and like the person who's holding that perspective is just an idiot. Like that's as far as that line of thinking goes. Just because of that label, socialism. And of course, where did that whole dynamic came from? Well, it came from our history with the Soviet Union and the Cold War and all of that, and McCarthyism and the whole Red Scare, all that stuff. And of course, there are legitimate concerns about socialism. So don't make the mistake of thinking here that I'm trying to advocate socialism as though socialism is somehow pure and can't create problems in the world. Not at all. I'm just saying that the way that most people in America think of the word socialism, and I mean, it's changing now. Socialism is sort of getting a renaissance these days. But still, a lot of people have a lot of negative associations with the word socialism, and it's because they have this very simplistic stereotype of it. I would bet a lot of money that most people who are triggered by the word socialism and have negative associations with it, that they have never actually studied any serious socialist theory, which is not to say that they have to agree with it. I'm not saying you have to agree with it. I'm just saying that these people, they've never even bothered to study it. They never even bothered to go to Wikipedia and read through the Wikipedia entry on socialism from beginning to end. You would think that before you demonize something, before you judge something, you would want to at least read through the whole Wikipedia page on socialism before you do that. Maybe like read through Karl Marx's works first before you start to judge it. And that's not saying it's right. It's not saying it's perfect. It's not even saying that we should adopt socialism. It's just that you got to see what your mind is doing with these simplistic, stereotypical labels. Also, another one that's very common these days is social justice warrior. It's like as soon as you label someone that, in a lot of people's minds, like immediately that just triggers like sort of an automatic response, and then that person's mind immediately either is like even for it or against it. Either that person is on the right side or that person is crazy, the deluded social justice warrior, or the opposite, the anti-social justice warriors, right? And so it creates this very simplistic black and white narrative. Another common label that's popular these days is cultural Marxism. This is a very disgusting label, because most people who say cultural Marxism have no idea really what culture or what Marxism are, nor the combination of the two. Feminism, of course, has a lot of cliche kind of negativity associated with it. Fascism also, so I'm not just speaking from the left liberal perspective here. A lot of liberals, for example, will do the same thing with the conservative perspective. They will just say that, oh, well, the conservatives are all fascists and they're all racists. That's also not right. That also takes away responsibility from really understanding the conservative mindset. Terrorism is another label that's used like that. See, it's very easy to just slap the label terrorist on somebody, and then you could say, well, we can just torture that person because he's a terrorist or a suspected terrorist. But what does that label even mean, terrorist? What does that really mean? Does terrorist mean that you kill innocent civilians using bombs? Is that what terrorism means? Most people would say, yeah, that's basically what it means. So, Leo, what's wrong with that? Isn't that wrong? Isn't that evil? Well, by that definition, the United States government is a terrorist organization because we kill civilians with bombs all the time, innocent civilians. So now you can say, well, no, okay, so we gotta fine tune that definition so it's not that. It involves more. It's like terrorist is like when it's done in the name of Allah or something. That's a terrorist. Well, okay, but but who's drawing those distinctions? And are you really studying the dynamic of terrorism, what it really is? Or are you just lumping a bunch of stuff together that you don't even understand, you've never studied, and you're just saying, well, those people, they're different, they're weird, they're stupid, they're wrong, they're crazy, they're criminal. So to hell with them. That's the whole point of the label terrorism, is to say to hell with them. That's the whole point of all these labels. Muslim, Jew. I mean, we can go on. There's hundreds of these labels that are used. I'm just giving you a small little taste. So these labels are then used to create these sort of simplistic black and white narratives of capitalism versus socialism, the good guys versus the bad guys, the Christians versus the Muslims, the Western civilization versus all the other lesser developed civilizations. And none of these narratives are ever true. The deeper you study the facts, you discover more and more complexity in all of these narratives. They just dissolve. And that's precisely why they're always accompanied with these sort of knee-jerk emotional reactions, is precisely because those knee-jerk emotional reactions keep you from investigating and questioning these narratives. And this polarizes people, polarizes society. We're seeing it happening right now. So when you stereotype the other side and you demonize them, of course, automatically you're going to lack interest in their actual statements. You're going to doubt and you're going to be suspicious of everything they say. You're not going to be able to look at the world from their eyes. You're going to fail to consider what points they might be making that might be partially true and partially valid. So again, it's this sort of like debate is so oversimplified that usually it's like, well, who's right? Is it the capitalists that are right or the socialists that are right? And it's framed in such a way as though like only one of them can be all right or all wrong, which is absurd because capitalism has so much different diverse perspectives within it. There are many different kinds of capitalists. And socialism also has a lot of diversity within it too. And there's a lot of overlap between the two, so they're not totally separate camps. There are governments, in fact, virtually all governments are a mixture of capitalistic elements and socialistic elements. There's no purely socialist country and there's no purely capitalist country either. It's always been a mix historically, even in China, even in the Soviet Union. It's always been a mix. So it's not really a question of who's right or wrong. It's a question of what is that delicate, complex balance that needs to be struck. Which elements are correct, which elements are confused, and there's plenty of confusion within both of them. Which is not to say that there's an equal amount of confusion. You have to actually go through all the details and figure out where the confusion lies. But when you stereotype that perspective as other, then you're not going to consider those partial truths that are contained within that perspective you're not looking at, and also you're not going to consider the partial falsehoods or limitations of your own perspective. And so by doing this sort of judging and stereotyping, people don't critically look at their own position. And that is exactly the whole point. It's really just a smokescreen from looking at one's own position. And also a smokescreen from looking at other interpretations. So in a cult, usually what's denied is that interpretation is happening at all. A point of view is presented within a cult as though it's not a point of view at all, as though there was no interpretation, as though it's just factual, just the facts. And this is where I have a lot of criticism against science. Because science, you would think, well, Leo, surely the opposite of a cult is science, and you would never find cult-like dynamics within science. But what does science do as a collective body but present its perspective on the world as though it's the ultimate factual truth, and that no interpretation is involved within science, and that science is just an objective matter? That's how science is presented. Now, of course, really high-quality scientists know better. Really high-quality scientists who have studied some epistemology, they understand that actually science comes with a lot of interpretation. And that most of reality presents us with various facts and this problem called underdetermination, which means that the problem is that there's a lot of different theories and models that we can create for the exact same set of facts. So which model and theory are you going to choose? This is what's called reality sort of being underdetermined. And so most people don't understand this about science. Most people don't understand that there can be multiple interpretations and just how much interpretation is going on within science. And this leads to a false sense of certainty. Because when you believe that what you've got is raw, pure facts, and that no interpretation, no subjectivity was involved at all, then it seems like, well, there can be no other possibility. This must be the truth. Because, science is not a perspective, it's just the objective truth. That's a very common trap that many scientists fall into. Of course, part of this whole dynamic of stereotyping and judging is closed-mindedness, which we've talked a lot about in the past. And also projection. So what the ego is doing in all this judging and stereotyping is that really it's a lot of times offloading those aspects of itself or of reality that it doesn't like, its shadow, and is projecting that onto others. So, for example, with terrorism, collectively, what the American collective ego is doing is that it doesn't like to admit that the U.S. military and various geopolitical maneuvering that we do as a country hurts a lot of innocent people, kills a lot of innocent people. We bomb a lot of innocent people in trying to defend our borders as a country. But see, that's all sublimated. That becomes our collective shadow, the American collective shadow, and then that's projected out onto the terrorists. And so now we fight a crusade against the terrorists who are the ones who kill all the civilians, and we say how evil they are for doing that. And of course, the terrorists aren't aren't angels. They are devils. And in certain cases, they need to be stopped. No question about that. But you got to look deeper at what is really behind the emotionality of this idea of terrorism. And a lot of it is just sort of this sort of unconscious projection of our collective shadow onto other nations, calling other nations the axis of evil. But take a look at how many civilians America has killed over the last 50 years compared to other nations, and I would bet that we come up pretty high on the list. Maybe number one, or pretty high up there. So, watch out for projection. So all of these subcomponents that I was talking about was just subcomponents of the one subcomponent of cult dynamics called judging and stereotyping and creating this group of other, creating the enemy out there. So notice how your favorite group does this. If you're part of an online forum, a Reddit subgroup, notice how you do this. If you're part of a sports team, notice how you do this. If you're in a corporation, notice how you do this against your corporate enemies. The corporate enemies out there, if you're an employee of Microsoft, you do this against maybe Google or Facebook or Apple and vice versa. Notice how your political party does this. Notice how your religious group does this. Notice how your family does this. There's a lot there to notice. Of course, notice how you do it personally, too. Another subcomponent, now we're moving on. So now the next subcomponent after judging and stereotyping is claims to absolute truth and denials of relativity. This is something that cults do very characteristically, but it's something that most groups do. Many people do this is they make claims to absolute truth and they deny relativity. Now, of course, you're going to say, Leo, but you talk about the absolute truth. So aren't you falling prey to this very same dynamic that you're speaking against? Well, first of all, you got to realize, don't fall into the trap of demonizing all of these dynamics. These dynamics are not just really about cults. These dynamics are dynamics of survival. This is how the mind survives. So I'm not saying that all these dynamics are necessarily bad or that they can all be avoided. But also, you have to make a distinction between those people who make claims to absolute truth, who have not actually directly realized absolute truth, and those who have. Now, that might seem like, well, Leo, but that's a self-serving distinction, because you're putting yourself into that category of people who have supposedly become conscious of the absolute truth, and then the other people who haven't. So how do you know? How do we know who has and who hasn't directly become conscious of the absolute truth? How do we know who's right? And that's exactly my point, is that you don't. You will never know until you yourself one day stumble into the absolute truth. And when it blindsides you and it mind fucks you, then you will know. But you will never be able to convince anyone else or tell anyone else about it. So it's like a black hole. You go in there and only you know what's inside and nobody else will ever know. That's how absolute truth works. So I'm not asking you to believe me that I have the absolute truth, nor am I saying that the things I talk about are the absolute truth, because nothing I talk about is the absolute truth, because the absolute truth can't be talked about. So one of the ways you can distinguish between people who are legitimately in possession of the absolute truth and those who aren't is that those who are conscious of the absolute truth, they will steer you away and they will tell you that absolute truth cannot be spoken of, nothing can be said about it, and that no belief is it, no idea is it, no amount of talking will get you there, and that it can't be qualified in any way whatsoever, because that's what makes it absolute. For that, you need to have an enlightenment experience. But anyways, I digress now. Back to the point is that notice your organization, your group, whether it's a religious group, your family, or whatever, what is held as the absolute truths of your group, of your community, of your society, of your culture. That's not really the absolute truth. Never. The culture never possesses absolute truth. but it sure does make a lot of claims to it. So be very mindful of that. Also be mindful of your own claims to absolute truth. Unless you've actually directly experienced absolute truth and you know what that word is referring to, then you haven't experienced it. And in that case, you can't make claims to it. And any claims that you do make to it, anything you do hold as absolutely true, is not. It's relative. Another subcomponent is a sense of absolute self-righteousness and certainty that often comes with, of course, the previous component of claims to absolute truth. Notice that the more cult-like an organization is, the more self-righteousness it will exhibit, and the more certainty it will have in its actions and behaviors and in its doctrines. Another subcomponent is that notice within cult-like groups how they tend to present one monolithic worldview that promises a solution to all of life's problems. They don't acknowledge the importance of multi-perspectivalism, of putting on different lenses and looking at the world from different lenses and different perspectives. Almost never does a cult encourage that. And so one way you can evaluate how cult-like an organization is how much does it encourage the exploration of multiple perspectives. And you can see in my own work, I do that quite a lot. I'm really passionate about that. I love that. And that's precisely what keeps you from getting locked into one perspective. Because, see, a cult's whole purpose sort of is to lock you into one perspective. It wants to monopolize the truth. That's what the ego wants to do. The ego loves to monopolize things. And of course, that's another dynamic, while we're talking about it, another subcomponent, how you can evaluate how cult-like is an organization. How much does it seek to dominate and monopolize whatever it's involved with? And you can see a lot of examples of this within business. For example, businesses, how monopolistic is your corporation? How much do they want to dominate and eliminate all other competitors? And you see many businesses are like that. And you might say, Leo, all business is like that. No, it's actually possible to run a business which is not monopolistic. That would be a more higher consciousness business. Conscious capitalism. That's sort of what I try to practice. For example, I make no aspirations to monopolize the teaching of self-improvement or self-actualization. I make no attempts to monopolize the truth, or I make no attempts to try to monopolize the entire field, because, like, to me, that's silly. I'm kind of more conscious than that. I see how that would turn my organization into a cancer. I don't want actually the work to become a cancer. That's what a cancer does, is it tries to monopolize everything. It tries to grow infinitely. For example, you see many tech companies and big pharma companies doing this. They create patents. They try to seize these patents, own these patents. They try to lobby government in order to give them more power so they can not be regulated. They can just spread themselves out everywhere. So Amazon is sort of doing this, sticking its tentacles into every aspect of everything. So, like, if we would let Amazon, what Amazon would do, unless it became conscious enough, the leaders of it became conscious enough, is that it would spread itself into every corner of society, into every country, across the entire world, and it would try to monopolize everything and basically enslave the entire world. Now, and I'm not saying this against Jeff Bezos or against Amazon. I'm saying that almost any modern corporation basically is trying to do this. But of course it fails. It doesn't succeed. Because actually the way that reality is structured, it's not possible to monopolize reality. And that's a deeper point that I'll talk about later. But it's not possible because reality is structured in such a way as to maximize diversity. So there's always this never-ending back and forth between monopolization and diversity. And so what happens is that consciousness is always sort of trying to monopolize everything, but then it also crumbles under its own weight. And so eventually what will happen is that Amazon will get so big, too big, that other forces will come into play and it will break it apart. Government will crack down on it. People will start to resent it. They will lose customers. And you're already basically starting to see some of this starting to happen. And also because they become so big, they are unable to innovate. They're unable to be creatively flexible in all of this. And so eventually smaller companies will actually overtake them in certain fields. And so this is how all of reality works, is through proliferation of diversification. This is how species evolve and how life evolves, how technology works, how business works, how government works, how nations work, how races work. This is a very deep point. Getting a little off track. So there's that. Watch out for this tendency within yourself and within your organization. Many religions try to do this. And the way that you can evaluate the quality of a religion is how monopolistic is it? Does it try to convert everybody? Then it's a pretty low consciousness religion, if that's its goal. Whereas not all religions are like that. There are some religions that aren't like that. They're not trying to convert the whole world. Like, for example, in fact, this is one of the nice things about Judaism, is that actually a lot of times, like, if you want to become a new Jew, you want to convert to Judaism, then you might go to a rabbi. And the rabbi, rather than saying, okay, yeah, come on, let's get people off the street to become more Jews, rather than doing that, most rabbis, if they're serious, actually what they do is they'll try to dissuade you. They'll say, oh, well, why do you want to become a Jew? Being a Jew is not good. Why? Prove to me that you really should be a Jew, and then maybe I'll think about it. And a lot of Zen temples do this as well. Like if you want to become a Zen monk, one story I heard about how it works in Japan in certain temples is that you have to go there and you have to knock on their gate if you want to become a new monk. You have to come with a letter of recommendation from some previous monk. Then you have to knock on the gate. You have to slip them the letter of recommendation, and then they make you sit outside the gates for 48 hours. And you keep knocking and you keep asking, like, hey, can I come in? I want to become a monk. And they say, no, go away. You're worthless. We're never going to accept you. And so they keep doing that and doing that. And you have to keep knocking, and they keep kicking you out, and telling you no and no and no. So they do this for 48 hours. And then if you sit through all that, finally they'll open the gate and they'll let you in. See? So it's like the opposite of trying to proselytize and convert others. That's the sign of a more evolved sort of religion. Another subcomponent of cults is that they love to emotionally manipulate and control people. They love to intimidate, to charm, to seduce, to withhold approval and love, to shower people with disapproval and scorn, to ridicule them, to humiliate them, finding ways to squeeze them, to pressure them, to leverage them, to put them into an impossible position. Because this is what low consciousness egos do, is they behave this way. So notice how much your organization does this. Your company, your boss, your religious leaders, your managers, your political leaders. The more they do this, the less consciously developed they are. This desire to control people is just like a dead giveaway of underdeveloped people. Highly developed, highly conscious people do not have a desire to control or manipulate anyone. And in fact, manipulation, and especially psychological and emotional manipulation, if you're doing it, for example, in relationships, this is one of those things that it's just a dead giveaway, that you have a lot more work to do, because manipulation actually separates you from truth and from being. But more on that later. There's a lot to say about manipulation. But one other subcomponent is also the manipulation of lower emotions. So a lot of times you'll notice corporations, groups, people trying to manipulate you, specifically appealing to fear, anger, hatred, guilt, embarrassment, because they know that these are the emotions that sort of get a knee-jerk response from you, making you very easily manipulated to do that person's bidding. So if I want you to attack someone for me, or if I want you to donate lots of money to me, or if I want you to work long hours for me. One of the ways I can do that is I can try to manipulate you by scaring you, or by making you hate some other group out there, or by making you feel very guilty, and so you'll donate to me. You see? So you can see how, from my perspective as the one who's doing the manipulation, it would be very profitable and very lucrative in a sense that it would significantly increase my odds of survival and reproduction if I was really good at manipulating lower consciousness emotions, which you can see our current president of the United States doing very well right now. See, that's his whole shtick. That's all he does. That's what he's been doing his whole life. He's a master at manipulating lower emotions. And that's what demagogues do. Because demagogues, usually they're not very conscious, but they can certainly whip someone into a frenzy. You know, Hitler was great at whipping himself and his people into a racist frenzy of fear and anger and hatred and blame and demonization. And then, you know, when you do that, then that can be very, very motivating. You can move mountains with that force of energy, but it's also very toxic and pathological and self-destructive in the end, as you see, you know, what happened. So it works for a short time, but then it collapses. And of course, you see that happening with the current administration in the U.S. You see the presidency collapsing. You see the Republican Party collapsing right now. And that's why. Because unconscious dynamics aren't sustainable. They only work in the short term. Another subcomponent of cult dynamics is cults tend to be very materialistic and pragmatic in an odd sort of way. So on the one hand, cults can be very sort of idealistic and they can have lofty religious purposes and goals. And a lot of religions have, you know, these spiritual goals, and it seems like religion is the opposite of materialism. Or is it? Look at how those people actually behave. Sure, they love to cloak themselves in lofty ideals and talking about Christ and the love of Christ and how important it is to be Christ-like, but then look at their actual lives. And mostly what you see is that you see these very same people actually being extremely materialistic and pragmatic in their business endeavors, in the way that they recruit people to their religion, in the way that they even conceive of religion, you know, of a physical heaven that you go to, of a physical God somewhere in the clouds with a beard who physically wrote a Bible. This is all a very materialistic version of religion. And it's actually very pragmatic. Like, for example, you look at the Catholic Church, you would think that, well, the Catholic Church, they're crazy and they're living up in fantasy land. No, the Catholic Church is extremely pragmatic. They run that organization just like a business. They have bank accounts with billions of dollars. They have sophisticated infrastructure for handling donations, taxes. I mean, they have their own bureaucracy. They have like basically their own government in the Vatican. They're extremely bureaucratic and pragmatic and super materialistic, which is the whole hypocrisy and the whole ridiculousness of it. Any time that a religious or a spiritual organization becomes pragmatic and materialistic, you can already tell it's gone off the wrong track. I mean, it's on the wrong track. And so when this happens, ethical principles fly out the window because they're violated in pursuit of success. So look at how your organization does this too. Look at how your corporation, your business does this. Do you really care about following ethical principles, or, you know, is it success at any cost, any means? Most marketing works this way. Most marketing, the way that it's taught, it's like, well, if it gets you the most eyeballs, then who gives a fuck? Do it. Doesn't matter. And most large Fortune 500 companies operate this way. So, like, for example, if there's a big pharmaceutical company and they're making an evaluation of whether to put some new drug on the market or not, and then one of their scientists, you know, says, but you know, this drug has certain side effects that might kill a few people, and then they might sue us, and that would be bad. And the way the business managers think about that, the Wall Street types, is they say, well, but okay, so how many people is it going to kill? Okay, so it's going to kill only 100 people. Okay, so 100 people, each one of them sues us for $5 million. That's $500 million. Okay, but how much are we going to make? Oh, we're going to make $20 billion? Okay, yeah, just let's do it. Who cares? I mean, we're net positive. We're net profit making, so it doesn't matter. We'll just pay the legal fees and we'll make some settlements. It won't matter. It's very typical Stage Orange thinking. Also, marketing through stimulation of fear, greed, and vanity. How common is that? Look at how most marketing is done. Look at the buttons they're trying to push in you. Also, marketing through controversy, polarization, clickbait titles. Have you seen this? I mean, most of the internet, most of mainstream internet is predicated upon this. Most YouTube videos, the most popular YouTube channels, they're all predicated upon what? Controversy, polarization, clickbait titles. Scandalous topics and scandalous thumbnail pictures. Tabloid type stuff. So that's a cult-like dynamic that I want you to see. Look at how even the government does this. It's not just business. For example, in wartime, during World War II, I've shown this before, I've shown some posters of how the U.S. government demonized the Japanese, literally as demons, with fangs and claws, or how they demonized Nazis also as devils, and vice versa. You know, they do the exact same thing in the other country to us. Another subcomponent of cult dynamics is the lust for power, money, sex, fame, love, meaning, and purpose. So how much does your organization lust after those things? How much is it fueled by those things? The more it is, the more cult-like it's going to be. Another subcomponent of cult behavior is a heightened sense of self-importance and a belief in a divine mission. And of course, this divine mission then justifies any means. So how much do you believe you have a divine mission? And how willing are you to pursue it at any means? Do you have a divine sense of self-importance and mission such that if I said that, oh, well, you could kill that puppy over there and it would help you to achieve your divine mission, would you kill that puppy? And you would say, yeah, sure, no problem. It's all good as long as my mission gets met. Well, there you go. That's very cult-like. Now, of course, most people wouldn't do that. But, you know, hey, never underestimate the Wall Street types. They probably would lower a basket of puppies into a cauldron of boiling water if it earned them a few $1 million. So take a look at how much you do that as well. Also, another subcomponent is pride, taking pride that you are part of the good guys. This dynamic is very prevalent, for example, in sports. And sports, of course, are extremely tribal, have a lot of collective ego in them. The whole point of almost watching sports is less about the sport and more about the pride. Pride in your country, if it's the Olympics, or pride in your city or in your state, in your team. It's rather ridiculous when you think about it. All sports really do, the whole appeal of sports is just, it's preying on low consciousness pride. Another common dynamic with cults is that they tend to split off and form new subcults and subgroups, and as they do that, they always demonize the old one that they left. So you see this with the history of religion most clearly. But it happens, for example, with businesses and corporations as well. You see this all the time. It's almost like a bacterium, splitting through fission. It splits apart, creates a little baby bacteria, and then the baby always demonizes the parent, sort of, in this situation, right? Because the whole point of this cult or this group is that it's trying to create its own sense of identity. So oftentimes the best way to do that is to split off from some larger group, create yourself, but then of course, because you're small, you're still small, you're not as big as the mama bacteria, you're still small, and you want to kind of assert yourself in the world. And so the way that you do that, because you're small and you're insecure and all this, is that you actually attack the thing that you came from. And of course, a lot of children do this with parents too. That's why children rebel against parents. That's why teenagers do that, because they want to establish their own sense of identity. And what's the fastest way to establish your own sense of identity? Demonizing some other group, and in your mind, clearly drawing a line between this is what I represent and that evil stuff is what they represent. And of course, oftentimes what that is a projection of your own shadow into that other. So you see this. You see, for example, a lot of, well, let's say Christianity, the fragmentation of Christianity. So Christianity was basically a cult of Judaism. Then once Christianity took over, became mainstream, then you had sort of the split between Catholics and Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Christians, which are still found in Eastern Europe and in that part of the world. And then the Catholics themselves, during the Protestant Reformations, they split apart into the various Protestant groups. And there was so many different, during Protestant Reformation, there were so many different sub-sects and cults of Christianity. And then we had in America later, we had Mormonism, and then Mormonism split off, blah, blah, blah. And so it just kind of, it just kind of fragments like this into this bouquet of diversity. So I want you to notice how your organization does that, or how you do that in your life. That can be quite eye-opening. And especially watch for the demonization part. So it's not a problem to split off. You know, it's okay to, for example, be part of Microsoft and then come up with your own business idea and then start your own business. That's okay, nothing wrong with that. Then maybe you compete with Microsoft. The problem where it gets pathological is when you start to demonize. See? You start to demonize. It's like, oh, Microsoft, they're the evil ones because they're trying to outcompete me and blah, 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 like that. And then, of course, the big group also falls prey to this dynamic. So, like, for example, a lot of times what happens is that the big group will then try to crack down on the little group. So, for example, when the Protestants were trying to split off from the Catholics, of course, try to crack down. And, of course, there was physical violence, physical coercion, various kinds of inquisitions were started, and probably many kinds of wars resulted from this, because basically they didn't want the diversity of Christianity. They wanted to monopolize Christianity into this one simple little thing. And basically the same thing happened during the Civil War. You know, the Confederacy wanted to split off from the entire U.S. And of course, the entire U.S., a union, didn't want to let that happen. So there's a whole war about that. So you see this everywhere in society, everywhere in history. Look out for that. Another thing I told you is that a subcomponent of cult-like behavior is that you're told to ignore your own perceptions. Notice how this happens in whatever enterprise you're a part of. This is a very sneaky one. For example, science does this. And most people would deny that science tells us to ignore our perceptions. And yet that's exactly what science does. Science is almost predicated upon the rejection of first-person phenomena. So, for example, you tell a scientist that you had a mystical experience. What's he going to do? He's going to dismiss that and say, oh, well, that's just first-person phenomena. That's just perceptions. Doesn't matter. Perceptions could be confused. You're just hallucinating. Or you tell a scientist about a psychedelic and you say, here, take this psychedelic. And he says, no, well, what's the point of taking a psychedelic? Because if I take this psychedelic, it's just going to be hallucinations and just sensory data, sensory experiences and perceptions. And we know that you can't base science on perceptions. First-person experience. See? Science rejects phenomenology. Science rejects the subjective. That's science's shadow, is the subjective and first-person phenomena, which is, of course, the only thing that exists and the only thing science could be predicated upon. But because science is in denial about it, it has to repress that, project it outwards, and then science demonizes religious groups and mystics and people who use psychedelics and all this other sort of phenomenological investigation. Science demonizes that because that's sort of inherent to the enterprise of modern science. Because it's rejecting perceptions. Literally, to be a modern scientist, you have to, it's crazy. You have to ignore perceptions. That's what you have to do to be a great scientist, because you have to be completely absorbed and lost to compete with other scientists. You have to be completely absorbed and lost within concepts, within your imagination, to create scientific theories, because scientific theories are imagination concepts. They're not perceptions. You can't perceive a scientific theory. You don't perceive gravity. You invent gravity with your mind as a concept and as a theory, and then you formalize it using equations and things, and then you have to convince yourself that all of those equations, formalizations, and models and maps that you made are actually real and that they were out there in the world and that you didn't actually create them. And that they're more real than your first-person experience of life. And that stuff, your imagination, all your concepts and theories, that's what's objective, and this stuff here, what you actually feel and experience, actuality, this is all the flaky stuff. This is all the subjective stuff. It's a complete 180 devilry is what it is. You're turning black into white and white into black. All of modern science is predicated upon this. Notice this. Double check for yourself. Don't believe me. Another subcomponent is fear that the world is coming to an end, and this sense of urgency that motivates you to take action. Notice how common this is. Fear that the world is coming to an end. See, the ego always fears death. That's what it's always struggling against. And there's different versions of this. So spiral dynamic stage blue people, for example, will fear that the world is coming to an end because the moral fabric of society is unraveling. And it's all those social justice warriors and gay people and minorities who are taking over, and it's all now becoming vulgar, and no one has any moral upstanding anymore. No one believes and reads the holy book. This is what's going to destroy society. That's how Stage Blue thinks. It's like God is going to punish us and deliver Armageddon because of the gay people. You can go find videos of preachers talking this way. I'm not making this shit up. That's spiral dynamic stage blue. And then at spiral dynamic stage orange, it changes. The fear of the world coming to an end is different. Now maybe it's going to be more like a fear of economic collapse, or maybe fear that the world will come to an end because terrorists will get a hold of a nuclear weapon. And it's those crazy religious people. It's all of the religion. If we could just get rid of religion, society would be perfect. Everything would be peachy, and science would deliver us to salvation. That's the origin version of this Armageddon story. And then the stage green version of this Armageddon story is of course global warming and ecological collapse. That's the green version. And so you see all of this motivates cult-like behavior at every stage of the spiral in a different way, gets the ego a sense of urgency. Now we can rally a group around this. Stage blue people will rally a mob, a fundamentalist religious mob. Stage orange people will, rally some military industrial complex to go destroy the terrorists. And the stage green people will come into a drum circle to talk about, global warming and stuff like this. And then this will create a shared ideology between those people. And then now we're off to the races. Now we have a group. Now we can create a structure around this. Now we can monetize this. Now we can, create a whole collective ego around this. Now we can demonize everyone else that we don't agree with. And then so people disagree about what's going to lead to the collapse of the world. And of course, what that really is just a projection of themselves. It doesn't say so much about the world. It says more about you. Whatever your theory of how the world is going to end, that says something about you. So like if you fear that AI are going to kill us all, well, that says something about you and where you are at your level of consciousness and development. And then when you're at the highest level, you ain't going to give a fuck if the world ends tomorrow. It won't matter to you. You'll be sitting there with a smile on your face. It won't matter because you realize it's all just a dream. Another subcomponent of cults is they create a sense of identity through being a good rule keeper. Don't underestimate this dynamic. A lot of people find it very attractive to be the rule keepers in the world. They really they get off on this. They love keeping the rules. These are usually the people who are like the military types, the policemen of the world, the firefighters, the religious moralists. They get their whole sense of identity from being a rule keeper. And so I'm going to be the good one because I'm going to enforce the rules against all those other evil people out there. I'm going to be the policeman of the world. And of course, as the policeman, I'm the good one. I'm the morally righteous one. So notice how you do that. Notice how your group or business or religion or political party does that. Another subcomponent of cult behavior is loyalty and favoritism over competence. Notice how much your group or your boss or whoever does this. Do they tend to prefer competent people or those who are most loyal to them? The less developed a person is, the less conscious they are, they're going to go for loyalty and favoritism over competence. Because competence requires a certain objectivity, and you have to stand off. You have to separate yourself at least a little bit from your own personal egoic needs in order to be able to evaluate various people's competencies and then pick the one that's actually competent. So like maybe you have 3 people who apply to your job. Let's say you have an important job, and you'll have an Asian person, a black person, and a white person apply. And then, you have a guy who's the boss who's making these decisions. He's not very developed, not very conscious, and he's himself is white. So of course, he's automatically gonna show favoritism to the other white candidate, like automatically. Because even though it would be better in the long run for his business to really pick the most competent person, let's say maybe the black person's the most competent one, looking at the resume. But that won't matter because the ego will be so selfish and so self-involved with its prejudices and stereotypes that it will discount that and pick the white one, and it'll convince itself that actually the white one is the one who's most competent, and it'll create various kinds of stories and justifications to convince that person that he's made the right choice. See, so to outgrow that, you have to develop yourself and become more conscious, become conscious of these self-biases that you have, and then learn to be objective. But that's very hard to do if you're wrapped up in all these cult dynamics. Another common subcomponent of cults is indoctrination camps and trainings. How many indoctrination camps and trainings have you gone to in your life? And with which organizations? Your religious organizations, Sunday school, elementary school, middle school, high school, university, graduate school, business trainings. What is that but indoctrination camps? Also, indoctrination of the youth. That's a very common characteristic of religions and cults. They want to get you early because that's the easiest way to inject yourself permanently into someone's mind is to get that person early. Get them with that religion when they're still, 3 years old. Baptize them real young. Start reading to them real young about the Bible and about Jesus and all this, right? So, but don't think that this is somehow exclusive to Christianity or religion. This is exactly what happened to you with science, for example, or with atheism, or with whatever kind of judgments that your parents taught you, or with whatever kind of racial preferences you have. It was all indoctrinated into you when you were still very young. And that's fundamentally why this work is so difficult, why epistemology is so difficult, because it was hardwired into you when you were so young that you weren't independent enough to really have a choice. And so now you have to basically undo that programming. That's very difficult to do because it's lodged very deeply inside your brainstem. Another common subcomponent is exploitation of workers. Cults love to do that. How much does your organization love to do that? How much do you love to exploit workers yourself? Also, overwork is used as an indoctrination technique in many cults. What they do is they overwork you to actually help to indoctrinate you. Because when you're so busy working, you don't have time to really think for yourself or to become independent. But then again, how many non-traditional, non-classic cult groups do this as well? For example, the U.S. Army does this with boot camps. Many corporations do this. Many, for example, doctor residencies. If you're trying to become a doctor in the United States, they will work you to death. Many prestigious law firms will work their new lawyers to death in this way. And you might think, well, that's just because, they need to get a lot of work done. Well, that's true on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's sort of a much more subtle and sneaky and devilish motive actually behind this tactic, is that by overworking you so much, they make it easier to indoctrinate you and to make you part of their collective, whatever that is. So by putting you through the ringer of a military-style boot camp in the Army, for example, that gets lodged very deeply inside your brain, and then that conditioning will now run you for the rest of your life. That's how a lot of Army people are. And same way for a lot of these doctors and lawyers. Once you go through one of these brutal residencies as a doctor, you're going to be fully bought in to the Western medical establishment. You're going to be fully bought into that entire system. It's going to be very difficult for you to ever leave that or to question that or to consider other non-Western paradigms. And of course, that's good for the system. That's good for Big Pharma. That's good for the whole medical industry in the United States. That's good for the status quo. Because they don't want you to have time. Like as a doctor, they don't want you to actually have time to question their practices. They don't want you to actually question Big Pharma and question Western medicine and to actually ask the question wait a minute, I gave this pill to my patient, but I saw the patient a month later and he didn't get better. If you're so busy working all the time, you don't have time to check in with your patients a month later to see if what you actually did for them actually solved the root issue or not. Because most doctors are kept so busy, they're just writing out prescriptions. They're not even checking with their patient. They're not even asking the patient what the real issues are. They're just writing out prescriptions. I mean, it's insane. And, some fraternities and sororities have hazing processes, brutal hazing processes that they will put their new members through precisely because that allows you to indoctrinate people better. And then, working together against some external obstacle that brings people together. Another common tactic is keeping a tight schedule so that you're so busy that you don't have time to really ask questions. And that's a lot of what schools do, colleges do. One of the most toxic elements of our education system right now in the West, I don't know how it is in other places, but in America, and I assume in Europe as well, is we put students through the ringer of taking more and more AP classes and just more tests and more studying. And it's more and more. And then you need summer school. Then you got to take extra classes and this and that. You're just so busy basically from the point where you enter high school to the end of your university studies, that by the time you're done with that, you had no time there for deep self-reflection and deep contemplation and really thinking through the theories and the ideas, actually matching them up with your direct experiences and working with them and understanding them. Almost none of that is possible because you're just constantly just trying to keep up with the school workload and memorization and tests and scantrons and multiple choice questions and this and that and extracurricular activities, trying to get into college and trying to be, the perfect student, all of that. That's basically a cult indoctrination technique right there. Another subcomponent of cult-like behavior is sophisticated PR campaigns and fake front organizations. But this is not exclusive to cults. Companies do this. Oil companies do this. Big pharma companies do this. Political action committees and organizations do this all the time. The devil needs a fake front because he can't be looking like a devil. He has to paint himself as an angel, and that takes a lot of work. There's thousands, probably millions of people in the United States alone working for these PR campaigns and marketing groups and fake front organizations just to give a nice, pretty face to all of the bullshit and egotism and selfishness that this corporation or organization puts out and does to mask it. You see, so there has to be an enormous self-deception campaign or just deception campaign going on. And of course, these people who work on these fake fronts and all these marketing campaigns, they convince themselves that actually what they're doing is they're just making a living. And they don't see the larger dynamic that they're playing, how they're contributing to the evil of the world through their marketing. Marketing is like the devil's favorite tool for masking and spreading his evil. Doublespeak is another component of cults. And what doublespeak is just language which calls something the opposite of what it actually is. So basically, as the devil, I'm going to call black white and white black. I'm going to call whatever I'm doing good, even though what it might be is evil. So if I'm lying, I'm going to call myself honest. You know, if I'm cheating, I'm going to say that I'm actually not. If I'm stealing, I'm actually going to paint myself as though what I'm doing is actually donating or giving or helping rather than stealing. If I'm leeching off someone, I'm going to say that I'm contributing to them and helping them. So cults create these kinds of labels, these doublespeak like labels, and so does society, various kinds of euphemisms that we use to kind of whitewash our egotism collectively and individually. So notice how you do that. Notice how your organization does that. Another subcomponent of cults is obedience to mechanical rules and norms. You can very clearly see this within religion, but you also see it, for example, within academia. You see it in universities, you see it in schools, you see it in businesses, you see it within bureaucracies and governments. Notice how you yourself become obedient and addicted to various kinds of mechanical rules and norms. Another subcomponent is impossible ideals. So if you've noticed with traditional fundamentalist religion, one of the problems is that it puts up these high ideals of how you're supposed to be Christ-like and how you're supposed to be super religious and all of this, and how you're not supposed to be tempted by sex and tempted by money. But then, of course, deep down inside, these are all just facade. These are just words, just ideas and fantasies. The person is not conscious or developed enough to actually be able to embody these ideals. And so cults tend to have these impossible ideals that very few people can meet, which of course makes you feel guilty, makes you feel like you're not good enough, ruins your self-esteem, and that makes you even more susceptible to the cult or to the religion or to the business or to the whatever, fill in the blank. Maybe your parents did this to you, set you up with various kinds of impossible ideals and denied you love because you weren't able to meet these ideals. And now, you're still running around trying to get the approval of your father or your mother. A big subcomponent of cult-like behavior is, of course, seeking comfort in certainty and authority. That's one of the key things that a cult offers, is certainty, that you have the right worldview and an authority figure. And don't overlook the appeal of an authority figure, because very many people grew up in dysfunctional families without decent fathers or mothers, who were negligent or absent or whatever, and they never really had that father figure or that mother figure that they really wanted. And oftentimes, even if the father or mother was there, they didn't love them, or they were too idealistic with them, or they were too disapproving of them. They didn't approve of your career. They didn't approve of your relationships, who you had sex with, what kind of boys or girls you liked, and all of this, right? They didn't approve how you dressed. So imagine now, what if you could find a new mother or father surrogate, sort of authority figure. And now this one will offer you the answers to all of life and truth. And now you don't need to actually go and explore the world. You don't need to read a bunch of books. You don't need to struggle through meditation and self-inquiry and contemplation, studying a bunch of different perspectives. This takes a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of energy gets expended on this. Mental, emotional labor, it's difficult reconciling these paradoxes. You're trying to sort through all this stuff. You're confused. So instead of all that, you could just go find a father or mother figure, some guru, who you will outsource the seeking of truth too. You will just ask them. Anytime you have a question about life, you're not going to question yourself or try to like introspect and find the answer within you. You're going to try to get the answer from them. And then you're going to, of course, start to worship their personality. You're going to get attracted by their charisma and their charm and their eloquence. Of course, they're going to be eloquent. They're going to be nicely dressed, and you're going to look up to them like a father figure, mother figure. Because this one you could actually choose. You know, your real mother or father, you couldn't choose them. But here you can actually choose when you can find one that fits with your own wounds and emotional egoic needs. And then, of course, you're going to start to worship this leader and follow this leader. And that becomes an addiction in and of itself, is just to surrender to some leader who tells you what to do with your life and gives you all the answers to life. There's a sort of a tendency in human beings to try to please powerful father figures, both for men and for women. A lot of men, most of what they spend their life doing is just trying to like please their fathers. And so this tendency for an authority figure becomes very seductive. So notice how this is happening, not just in cults, but this is happening in religions, mainstream religions. It's happening in politics. It's happening in government. It's happening in business. It's happening within sports. It's happening with actors and celebrities. It's happening with YouTubers. Notice how you do this. How you create these sorts of leaders. Notice how you do that with myself. There's a sort of a leader-follower dependency fantasy that's created, as though like you're following me. And then you don't want to disappoint me, and then I don't want to disappoint you. And then we get this kind of dynamic going. That's a lot of what happens within cults. And then, of course, once this happens, you start to idolize and lionize the leader, the authority figure, because they are dispensing truth to you and they are a sense of direction in your life, because you don't want to take responsibility for actually making hard choices. You just want to be told what to do. And then, of course, by that time, now you start to believe that the leader can do no wrong, because you want to paint a simplistic picture of the leader as either good or bad, black or white. And this is what happens. This is what's happening with Trump right now. Is his supporters see him as not being able to do any wrong, not being able to do any wrong. And then, look at this happening in Islam with Muhammad. Muhammad can do no wrong. Look at Buddhists with the Buddha. Buddha can do no wrong. Look at the Rajneeshis with Osho. Osho can do no wrong. Look at the Pope in Catholicism. The Pope is infallible. So notice how this happens outside of religion. Part of this subcomponent of certainty and authority is also blaming whistleblowers. So as soon as someone in the group stands up and starts just maybe badmouth the leader or whatever, then oftentimes the whistleblower gets blamed and demonized and scapegoated. Look at, for example, what happened with Edward Snowden and the whole NSA spying, wiretapping situation that's going on here in the U.S. He was demonized and basically might even be executed in the future if the U.S. gets its hands on him. Of course, unwillingness to admit wrongdoing goes on in order to reinforce the sense of certainty and authority. Rejection of criticism and feedback. Of course, no cults allow for criticism or feedback, and many other kinds of organizations also suppress it. So notice how your organization does that. The more conscious and developed an organization, the more it's going to allow for criticism and various kinds of feedback, and it's actually going to solicit feedback and take the feedback seriously. And of course, avoidance of responsibility. The whole appeal of joining a cult is that you get to avoid responsibility. So notice how you do that with other kinds of groups that you join. It helps you to avoid responsibility and independent thinking and making your own decisions. Another subcomponent of cults, like we talked about in part one, is that whole, remember that pyramid structure, that authoritative pyramid structure? Well, I want you to notice more broadly in society all the areas that you see a pyramid structure that requires constant growth in order to sustain it. That's literally the definition of a pyramid scheme. So notice how many pyramid scheme-like structures there are in society, like the military-industrial complex, or the government, or corporations, or Wall Street, or capitalism as a whole. Requires, for example, never-ending economic growth, which is absurd. Wall Street requires company to grow faster and faster and faster. They don't care about how much the company earns. They care about how much the company earns more than it did last year. So they want an acceleration of earnings every single year. But of course, it's impossible. It's unsustainable. It's really kind of like a pyramid scheme, and it's waiting to collapse. So notice how this kind of structure happens. And then also notice how people, this is another very prototypical cult dynamic, is that people try to position themselves at the top of the pyramid in order to leech off of it. That's the whole point of starting a cult for the cult leader, is to leech off the top of the pyramid. So notice how that's happening within government, with lobbyists and corrupt political leaders, in the military, with corporations. You know, how many people in corporations are trying to climb the corporate ladder to the very top because they know they can leech off of that. Because the higher they get, the more power they're going to have, the more they can exploit the everyone below them. That's the whole point of these pyramid schemes. Notice how even in universities, there are pyramid schemes in universities, most organizations. Now, I'm not saying a pyramid scheme or just a hierarchy is necessarily wrong. I mean, hierarchies are actually very important, and I'll talk in the future about hierarchies. They do serve important structural functions within nature and reality as a whole. So we need hierarchies. You can't just level every hierarchy. But I want you to specifically notice how people build these pyramid schemes with the intent to leech off of them, and how maybe you are doing the same thing with your business or your corporation or your organization or your religious movement or whatever. Another subcomponent we talked about with cults is information control, secrecy, and lack of transparency. So this is super common across all of business, government, and basically religion and everywhere. Filled with all sorts of secrecy and lack of transparency. And that's because the ego and the devil, does its dirty work in the shadows, not in the light. So notice how you do this or your organizations do this, trying to conceal the true agenda of your business or your corporation or your entity. Notice, the skeletons that are hidden in the closet. Even within your own family, for example. Notice how information is controlled, how secrecy is maintained, and the lack of transparency that's there. Lack of open lines of communication. In your intimate relationships, notice how this goes on. Notice how much you withhold information and how secretive you are. In your intimate relationship, in your marriage. That's cult-like behavior right there. Another common characteristic of cults is restricting contact with outsiders. Hanging out only with people you agree with. Hanging out with people only of your race or your religious orientation. Well, notice how you do that in your life. Do you really surround yourself with the diversity of people and perspectives? And employees, if you're a boss, for example? Or do you just tend to get people who reinforce your existing ideas? And then, a lot of corporations even make you sign contracts that restrict you from being able to go and work for another corporation in the same industry if you leave their corporation. That's like exactly what cults do. Sign these non-compete agreements and so forth. Another common characteristic of cults is that they deny and excuse any collateral damage that their actions cause. So notice how you do that. Notice how your government does that. Notice how your business does that. Notice how your industry, if you're an entire industry, notice how your industry does that. Like If you're in the pharmaceutical industry, notice how the pharmaceutical industry refuses to take responsibility for its collateral damage. And so do you. Maybe you're just a secretary working for some big drug company, and you don't make any big decisions. But nevertheless, you're part of this organization that causes a lot of collateral damage. Are you taking responsibility for that? Not in a way where you have to guilt yourself and tell yourself that you're bad, but I mean like really becoming conscious of what you're doing in life and how you're fitting into all these collectives that you're a part of and what these collectives are actually doing and how they're contributing to the kind of world that you either want or don't want. A very common component of cults is crusading, or the lesser jihad, as I call it. Externalizing your spiritual work. Being very busy out there without self-reflecting in here. Or making your life purpose the defeat of other people. That's like the definition of crusading in the lesser jihad. Make sure your life purpose is not predicated upon the defeat of somebody else or some other organization. That would be a big mistake. We also talked about a common subcomponent of cults as being sexual manipulation, abuse, and irresponsibility. So, of course, notice how much of that is going on around our society, in government, in your business, in your corporation, in the news, in relationships and families. Another subcomponent is not acknowledging the importance of balance. Cults don't appreciate the importance of balance. Oftentimes what a cult does is it takes a good thing too far. Like, yes, maybe your religion does have some important wisdom and insights, but when you try to take that and you try to convert the entire world to it, that's when the evil happens. You see? So it's not that the Quran doesn't have some beautiful insights, some valid insights. It does. Of course it does. The mistake is when you try to make everyone a Muslim. That's the mistake. You're taking a good thing too far, or you're taking it too literally. So like many religious books will have nice insights, but also they're filled with some delusions and some antiquated notions and stuff like that. And they're filled with some bigotries and some racism and some homophobia in this. So you're supposed to take the good stuff and leave the bad stuff. But people, they take it too far. They just want to say like, well, the whole Bible has to be true. The whole Quran has to be true. Like either it's all false or it's all true. And so if it's all true, we got to take everything. And, lack of discrimination, taking a good thing too far. It wasn't meant to be taken that way. Religious teachings were meant to be delicately interpreted, consciously thought about it and embodied in your life, not just like read and then literally followed like a simple robotic 1, 2, 3 step manual. That's not how religious texts were meant to be understood. So notice how you and your organization, whatever you're part of, doesn't acknowledge the importance of balance and takes it too far. So it's not that, drug companies are evil in the sense that, we shouldn't have any drugs. No, we need drug research. We need new drugs. That's all good. But it's like you're taking it too far. When you're trying to like market opioids to vulnerable people in the way that's been happening over the last 5 years or so in America, that's an example of taking a good thing too far. Opioids are necessary. Morphine, it's a good thing when you're at a life and death situation and you're in excruciating pain. It's great. But then, to hand it out like candy and then to incentivize doctors to do it through various kinds of sneaky marketing techniques, that's when you took a good thing too far. All right, let's take a quick intermission here, and we still have more to say, so stick with me. So I want to wrap up this episode and this whole mini-series by going through a list of cult-like organizations and events throughout history. So we're going to sort of run through human history here really quickly. I've already been sprinkling various examples from this list throughout the first part here where I was talking about the various subcomponents. But it's useful to just really get a sense for how significant these cult dynamics really are. We need to take this out from the realm of theory and abstraction. I want you to really see how this permeates and is characteristic of all human behavior, and of course, leading up all the way to the present. So, if you look at the origins of all religions, they are just rife with cult dynamics. And the only reason that any major religion today exists at all is because of cult dynamics. It couldn't exist otherwise. Take a look at the Crusades. What were the Crusades but various kinds of cult dynamics in action? Look at the conquest of South America and the New World with people like Cortez, Columbus, and Magellan. They were pretty much motivated by cult dynamics. And what went on with the founding of America and South America, various South American countries, that was all cult dynamics based. The Spanish Inquisition, cult dynamics. The French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, cult dynamics. The 16th and 17th century European witch mania, the hunting down of witches by the establishment Orthodox Church, cult dynamics. The Civil War, Confederacy, slavery, racism, ethnocentrism, nationalism, the KKK, predicated on cult dynamics. The Marxist revolutions of the early 20th century in Soviet Union, in China, in North Korea, and Vietnam and other places, cult dynamics. All the stuff that I talked about, all those subcomponents, you're going to find many of them operating within these examples that I'm talking about. Nazism and anti-Semitism, cult dynamics. Misogyny and anti-feminism, cult dynamics. McCarthyism, the Red Scare, cult dynamics. The way capitalism currently operates in the United States and the entire Wall Street apparatus, the military-industrial complex, the big pharma, cult dynamics. The 60s hippie counterculture revolution with psychedelics and all that stuff, cult dynamics. And also, of course, the crackdown on that revolution, was the reaction against it was sort of the counter revolution was also cult dynamics. And the demonization of psychedelics is cult dynamics. Stock market bubbles, cult dynamics. Trump, the alt-right, Fox News, Alex Jones, the Rush Limbaugh, and Breitbart News. This is all cult dynamics. The alt-right is predicated upon cult dynamics. What Trump is doing, all of the ways in which Trump motivates his base, the way that he interacts with them, the things he says to them, the way they respond to him, this is all classic cult dynamics. So even though technically I wouldn't call the alt-right a cult, because it doesn't fit that technical definition of an authoritative hierarchy, in a sense you could call it a cult. I mean, it's basically an online cult is what it is. The various Russian manipulation campaigns that we saw in the 2016 election and that are still seemingly ongoing with Facebook and various kinds of rigging of polls and online media advertising and all of this, the disinformation campaigns. What is this? The Russians are exploiting cult dynamics within the United States in order to sort of sabotage and sow chaos. And the only reason they can do that is because much of the U.S. population is ignorant about precisely everything we talked about in this mini-series. I mean, if people, broadly speaking, just watched and understood these two episodes about cult psychology, and they really not just intellectually understood it, but saw it in action in their own life, and they accepted it, of course. They have to agree with what I'm saying here, which is a bitter pill for many people to swallow. But if that was the case, if this was part of our standard education in elementary school, then a phenomenon like the alt-right or Donald Trump or Nazism or the KKK would just not be possible. That's why we're going into such detail about this, because this has very practical effects. And this is something that needs to be integrated. This understanding needs to be deeply integrated into our education system to inoculate people against this stuff. And it will help to not only reduce hardcore cults, It'll also help to reduce all sorts of other ideological and dogmatic phenomena, and religious nonsense, and even scientific nonsense, and all sorts of stuff like that. What about fads like Beanie Babies, Pokemon, Bitcoin, the fidget spinner? These are all based on cult dynamics. About a year ago, actually, my brother, he's really into techie stuff, and he was getting into Bitcoin, and he bought some tens of thousands worth of Bitcoin, I think. And he was making good money on it, but this was right when the Bitcoin market was like at the very, very peak, when Bitcoins were almost $20,000 per Bitcoin. And I remember he was talking about Bitcoins like back in the early days, like 8 years ago or so, when Bitcoins were just like a few dollars per Bitcoin. Now they're like 20,000. And then it dropped. So anyways, he was trying to get me to buy into them and invest like several tens of thousands of dollars into them because I was looking for an investment opportunity. And I was kind of hesitant. I was stalling and hemming and hawing. But I was almost going to buy in like at the peak at 20,000 per Bitcoin. And then I just kind of waited and it kept falling and falling and falling. And it felt to me like it was a fad. And sure enough, the market now has crashed to the point where it's like I would have lost a lot of money on that. See, so this stuff is very helpful. Another very interesting fad, I don't know, most people probably haven't heard of it. It's called the 17th century Dutch tulip mania. And this is detailed in a classic book about cult psychology and behavior of crowds, is The Extraordinary and Popular Delusions of Crowds. I think that's what it's called. It's a classic book where the author details all sorts of various kinds of herd mentality and interesting calamities that resulted. But one of the cases was the 17th century Dutch tulip mania, where tulips, the bulbs of tulips, they became like collectible items, and they became extremely prized for no good reasons, to the point where these tulips were being sold for thousands of dollars and even more, to the point where some of these tulip bulbs were the most expensive objects on the entire planet at that time. And so that lasted for a short number of years, then the whole market completely collapsed, and like, who even cares about tulip bulbs today? So you can see how cult dynamics are responsible for that. Terrorism and suicide bombing is a cult activity. Also, though, Islamophobia is a cult activity. And in case you think that I rag too much on conservatives, let me rag a little bit on liberals, because liberals are certainly not immune to cult phenomena, and I'm saddened to see quite a bit of it in many liberal outlets. So social justice warriors are certainly prone to it. Socialists and Marxists, there's a sort of a resurgence, like I said, there's a renaissance of socialism happening now, but there are dangers with that, of course, because it's going to get taken overboard. Too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing. And so we're starting to see that happen. Certain liberal, like YouTube channels that I like to watch, for example, TYT, if you're familiar with that one, The Majority Report, I like that one as well. But they also engage heavily in cult dynamics. Like, one thing you see them doing a lot is you see them demonizing and stereotyping conservatives. And this creates a further polarization, and it oversimplifies the conservative perspective and calling all conservatives fascists and the like. Well, actually, it does a disservice, and it only feeds into sort of the prejudices of the audience. And even though I like these channels, I see them much more evolved than Fox News, for example, or many of the alt-right sources. You got to watch out. You got to watch out, because it creates an echo chamber with a lack of diversity of perspectives, and that sort of judging, demonizing, stereotyping, and oversimplifying and strawmanning the other side, and just even creates the idea of another side, a sort of a separation between you or us versus the conservatives or versus Trump or whatever. And you gotta cut that shit out. That's not going to cut it if you want to go to the deepest levels of your development and consciousness. So watch out. It's hard to find really, really high quality news sources. So what I recommend as far as news goes, because most news sources are quite judgmental and polarizing these days, is just really diversify the sources that you look at and sort of consider many different perspectives. Which is not to say that consider all perspectives equal. That's also not the case. So a lot of times, even though these liberal news sources might demonize the conservatives and not fully give them credit, they're sort of generally more in the right direction than the opposite. Be careful with academia. There's a lot of cult thinking going on within academia. I mentioned wartime propaganda. That's a classic example. North Korean indoctrination. I have a book on my book list about North Korea. I highly recommend you read it. That's like a case study of cult dynamics taken to the extreme. And it's really interesting because it's like North Korea is basically like a cult, a classic hardcore cult scaled up to an entire nation. It's quite amazing that they're able to sustain it for as long as they have. And if you really want to understand what the North Korea situation is all about, you have to go read that book and look. It's going to open your eyes to the kind of indoctrination techniques that they use in their schools. Like it's crazy. Like that stuff is like science fiction, dystopian territory level of cult indoctrination. And there's a lot of lessons to learn from that. For me personally, studying the extreme examples helps to highlight and helps me to then understand the more subtle versions of it that then I see in America, or I see in Europe, or I see in my own life. Various scientific and philosophical schools. If you're a student of science and philosophy, then you know there's all sorts of different schools and subgroups and subfields that science and philosophy divides itself up into, and usually they war with each other. They're in conflict. And they also tend to polarize and engage in cult dynamics. And that hurts the enterprise of science and philosophy both. And a lot of times the way philosophy is taught, which I really don't like, is it's taught as like one school versus another school. It's like the materialists versus the idealists, or the anti-realists versus the realists, or the phenomenologists versus the analytical philosophers, or versus the continental philosophers. And this is just a bad way to frame it. The phenomena of incels, pickup, red pill, and the Jordan Peterson stuff that's going on these days on YouTube and in the media, very, very cult-like. Be very careful about that, because those basically are online cults. New atheism is also cult-like, with folks like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. You see that the people who believe in that and who really are fans of that, they become very cult-like in their commentaries and in their way of thinking. That's also like an online cult. It's sort of, with Sam Harris, it's interesting. It's like a cult of rationality, which you would think like, well, rationality is antithetical to cults. No, it's not. You can certainly create a rationality cult, which he's done. Also, with the occult, magic, witchcraft, and various kinds of other new age, what would we call them, fields, subfields, these can get very culty, so watch out for those if you're getting into that. Nationalism and patriotism is cult behavior, basically. Celebrities and rock stars, Paris Hiltons and the Kim Kardashians of the world and all this sorts of stuff, it's all cult, based on cult dynamics. Western medicine, very, very cult-like. Watch out, because that one could actually mean the difference between life and death for you if you get a serious illness or disease. Various kinds of cultural rituals that you might be attached to: circumcision, baptism, female genital mutilation, animal sacrifice, even human sacrifice, honor killings. These are all cult dynamics. And one really interesting one that I learned about just recently from Hinduism is called sati, S-A-T-I, sati. And what this is, it's a cultural ritual which apparently goes back centuries, maybe even millennia, in India, where, you know, Indians are very family-oriented. So if the husband of the wife, the husband dies and she becomes a widow, then under this sati ritual, sort of the ideal that the Hindu culture programs is that you're supposed to, as the wife, you're supposed to sacrifice yourself. The wife is supposed to sacrifice herself on the funeral pyre of her dead husband. And even to this day, even though there's laws in India against sati now, but this was a very common practice just 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. And even today, if you go on the Wikipedia page and look up sati, you will see that like every year, even now in the 2000s, every year, Indian women commit sati. And it's seen as like a sort of a prideful way to go out in life. So it's very interesting. And the only reason people do it is because of cult dynamics. Worshipping of various gurus, leaders, and presidents. For example, the way that the conservatives in America tend to look upon Ronald Reagan, and to quote Ronald Reagan is very cult-like. Even the way that we look at the founding fathers, in the way we try to like whitewash the history of the founding fathers and idealize them, is very cult-like. Watch out for social media, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Like I said, all cult dynamics are moving online these days. You know, cult dynamics are being modernized and are evolving with new technology. You know, when VR comes out, you're going to expect cult dynamics in VR. When massively multiplayer online games come out, you're going to see cult dynamics in those. Conspiracy theories are popular these days online. Flat eartherism and all sorts of various kinds of theories. What is that? That's cult dynamics right there. Government censorship, cult dynamics. Sports teams, I already mentioned those. The Super Bowl, the World Cup, the ridiculous amount of money and advertising that goes into that. All the sales, the salaries that athletes make. This is all predicated on cult dynamics. Gender roles. What are your opinions about male and female gender roles? Do you believe that male and female is a real physical, biological category? Whether you do or you don't, you probably have pretty strong opinions about gender roles. And I want you to notice how those were instilled in you through cult dynamics and how they're reinforced through cult dynamics. Hairstyles, cult dynamics, uniforms, suits, high heels, fashion. What constitutes luxury? What constitutes various standards of beauty? I remember when I was a teenager, like in the 90s, it was spiky hair. That was the best hairstyle for guys, spiky hair. And then it's like just the Justin Bieber hairstyle came in like the early 2000s, and it's always changing. So what is that but cult dynamics? Gangs are an example of cult dynamics. Abusive relationships. A lot of women, especially ones with self-esteem issues, get sucked into abusive relationships which can become very toxic and cult-like. Don't think that if it's just you and a guy, two people in a relationship, that is not enough to constitute a cult. It certainly can. And that's really sort of like the simplest way to start a cult. If you want to start a cult, do it with your wife or your husband, or your girlfriend or your boyfriend. And you get to be the cult leader, and they get to be the cult follower. And you can certainly do that. Right now I'm describing probably millions, literally millions of relationships in the world that fall into this category. Also, though, those can then turn into authoritarian and cult-like families. So, of course, like, let's say the father is a wannabe cult leader. So he sucks his wife into it. And then, of course, they have some children. And then they turn them into a sort of a cult family. And then, you have authoritarian families that dictate down. And then you see all the cult dynamics happening at a very kind of like micro local level right in that family. And if you're in one of these families, you came out one of these families, you know how dysfunctional that can be. You know how it's like a little bubble. Maybe your family was involved with criminal activity or abuses of various kinds, manipulations, exploitations, all the stuff that I mentioned up above. You're probably very familiar with those dynamics. And it's precisely because of that your life is so dysfunctional. You can change that, but it's going to take some work because, unfortunately, it's been programmed deep into you and you don't know any other way yet. But we can work on that through more self-development and consciousness. Polygamy is a cult dynamic. Indoctrination through television and advertising is a cult dynamic. Anti-vaxxers, it's a sort of a cult dynamic. And online forums can easily become very cult-like. So that's the list. I tried to just pummel you with example after example after example, because what you need to do with this work is you need to ground it. I tend to talk about very abstract concepts and things. And it's very easy for, especially many of you newbies, to not appreciate sort of how advanced some of these things that are being said are. We're talking about very advanced stuff here, very tricky stuff, very self-deceptive stuff that your mind will it'll just like slide off your mind. It'll go in one ear and out the other, unless you find ways to practice it and to ground the things I talk about, ground the theory in your everyday experiences. That's extremely important for you to do. So I give a lot of examples so that you can see just how practical and applicable all this stuff is, so that your ego mind doesn't just say, oh, well, Leo, it's just theory. It has nothing to do with my life. And, how could I possibly apply this stuff? What could this possibly do for me? Well, hopefully you can see just how far-reaching just this one concept of cult dynamics and cult psychology is. But really, everything I talk about is like that. To really understand what I'm talking about here, it's going to take you years of patiently, carefully observing and studying yourself, your family, your friends, your boss, your coworkers, your business, your government, your nation, your religion, your culture at large, your everything, the people you look up to, celebrities you like, and so forth. So start doing that. That's what you got to do with this stuff. It can't just be an idea like, oh yeah, Leo, okay, I understand it. That's way too intellectual. Yes, you got to start with the intellectual understanding, of course, but then you got to start to observe it and start to track it in everyday life. And then, of course, you got to look inside of yourself and see it inside yourself. It's not enough just to point your finger at saying, oh, look at that stupid person over there, and look at that Trump, and look at this Alex Jones, and look at these extreme examples of bad people sucking others into cults. No, you got to see how you're doing it. And that's where the real work begins, is when you start to see how you're doing it, because that's where it actually gets difficult. That's where your mind gets really tricky on you and tries to get you to avoid looking at your own behaviors and your own thinking patterns. Your mind doesn't want you exploring and investigating this stuff. But that's exactly what you need to do if you want to see results from the things that I talk about. As a culture in the West, in developed countries, we talk a lot about truth and integrity and democracy. But we don't teach people the actual underpinnings of democracy, the epistemic underpinnings. We don't teach people against the problems of authoritarianism. Yes, we give people a few examples from the history books, like Stalin or Hitler or whatever, but that's not nearly enough. What we really need is we need education of how authoritarianism is present in every ego, and how that manifests in your life even when you're a child and you act like a little tyrant or a dictator, or when you're a teenager, and how it works in your family and all of this. That's the kind of education that's necessary if we really want true democracy. See, because most people, when you ask them, oh, do you like democracy? They'll say yes. Do you like authoritarianism? They'll say no. But when they don't know how to spot cult dynamics, they get very easily sucked into a cult-like behavior by some wannabe authoritarian, which then undermines democracy. They don't understand that democracy, to really have solid democracy, you need to be able to be extremely conscious of your own self-biases and your own tendencies to get sucked into these various kinds of ideologies. And to see the bigger picture, see all these interconnections. Businesses hijack cult psychology to make money. Politicians hijack cult psychology to gain power. Intellectuals hijack cult psychology to become famous and well-known and build their reputations, which then, of course, also gets them lots of money and turns into a business. See that happening. See yourself doing it. See the temptations of it. Notice the devil alive within you. Most people are devils. And most people are devils because they're unconscious. And if they seem good on the surface, it's only because they're putting on a nice facade for you, because that's what's necessary for them to slip under the radar. And it's only working because most people have not acquired a lot of power, fame, or money. And so they really don't have a lot of opportunities to exhibit their devilishness. And then, of course, we see with those people who are powerful and famous and have a lot of money, then we see a lot of the devilish stuff that they do that comes out in the news. See it all the time. And there's nothing shocking about this. It's just because we're not really taught how any of this stuff works. And so, most people are closet authoritarians. Put them in power, give them a lot of money, give them fame, give them sex, and you're off to the races. They will enslave you if you give them the opportunity. So in conclusion, I want you to start seeing cult dynamics everywhere. Be able to see cults in the sort of rigorous technical sense that I defined in part one, and also be able to see cult dynamics everywhere in society and within yourself. And make sure that you don't demonize these things that I've talked about. Stop calling this stuff bad. This is not bad. This is how Maya works. This is how devilry is. Devilry is not bad. Devilry is a necessary, inevitable aspect of life and of reality and of the universe. Like a law of physics. You don't get mad at gravity. Don't get mad at cult dynamics. Some of this stuff may be unavoidable when we're dealing with large groups of people, organizations, hierarchies. Herd mentality necessarily comes out, but a lot of it can also be mitigated through really becoming conscious of how these dynamics work within yourself. So that's what I recommend that you do. All right, that's it. I'm done. Please click the like button for me and come check out actualize.org. That's my website. There you will find my blog. What else? The book list, my life purpose course, and the forum where you can come and talk about this stuff. The last thing I'll say is that really I've only shared like 5% of my understanding of reality with you through actualize.org. So stay humble. Don't think you've got it all figured out and that all of it has been explained to you. The majority of it I have not explained to you. And that's because it's challenging to articulate this stuff. It takes a lot of work to really understand how many of these dynamics work. And it's just like one of my greatest frustrations in running actualize.org is the fact that I can only communicate a tiny fraction of everything that I've realized and understood. And the most deepest stuff I can't really communicate because this medium is very limited. Even video is very limited. Even 3-hour-long videos are very limited for the kind of stuff that we're trying to understand. You have to understand that with actualize.org, we're like trying to understand everything. We have a much bigger goal than science or religion, traditional religion, or psychology or philosophy. Like we've bitten off a lot of stuff here. We're trying to understand the entire universe. And not just theoretically, but grounding it in our direct experiences and a deep exploration of ourselves as well. So it's not like science where science is out there, the objects of science are out there, and then we're doing science over here. So it's kind of like we're separate from the thing that we're observing using science usually. No. This is a very intimate, involved process where really you're running a mad science experiment on yourself, on your own mind. So there's still so much more that needs to be communicated. I'll probably spend the rest of my life trying to articulate it, and the frustration of it is that I'll never be able to put it all into words, no matter how much I try, because it's infinite. But I want you to be smart enough to realize that, and to realize that really with actualize.org, no matter, you watch a few of these videos, maybe you start to get excited about some possibility or possibility of a life purpose, or you get a little glimpse of some mystical insight or whatever. It's like, it's cool. Maybe you have an improvement in your mood, you have an improvement of your depression symptoms or whatever, and it starts to feel like, oh yeah, there's something there. This is kind of cool. I'm into it. Yeah, let's do some self-improvement. You don't even see 1% yet of this iceberg. So I really want you to appreciate how much there is here to explore about life, to understand about life, and how practical and how significant it is. Right? And the reason I'm telling you this is really I want you to become passionate about teaching yourself how to live. Not even through my teachings. Teach yourself how to live. Figure out life. Figure out why you're here. Figure out what motivates you. Figure out why your life is dysfunctional. Figure out how you're manipulated and controlled by your own emotional system. Figure out how to live healthily. Figure out how you're being manipulated and brainwashed by society, by your family, by your corporation, and all of this. Figure all this out. You can figure it out. That's like your ultimate purpose, is to figure it out. And the rewards for figuring out are so stupendous and awesome and gargantuan that they can't possibly be communicated. You can't possibly know how enormous the rewards will be until you're already deep into it. So you need to sort of be able to intuit that, because this work does take years. It takes years. It takes thousands of hours. That's what I'm talking about here, really. I'm interested in getting you bought in to the idea that you should be spending thousands of hours doing this work. And it's a little hard to do that because how do I convince you to do that when you haven't really felt the fruits of it yet? I guess you got to either be smart enough to intuit it, or you got to just take a leap of faith or whatever. But hopefully you can see that if you are able to truly figure out life, all of life, not just on a social level or psychological level, but on a metaphysical level, you're able to figure it out on all these different levels. You're able to figure out how to live. You can do that, you can do that. And you're not going to read that in any book. No book will tell you this. No course will tell you this. This is an intimate process because you are intimately at the center of your very life. But I'm telling you that it's possible to do, that this is the most worthwhile thing you can do in your life. And you can verify that for yourself. You don't need to believe me on that. It would help if you started by believing me on that. Because, if you're too skeptical, then you're not going to do any work, nor any research, and then you're stuck. But you need to go and verify the things that I say for yourself. And then at some point it'll hit you. It'll hit you the significance of this. And even then, you'll still not be at the bottom of the iceberg. You'll still be only scratching the surface of it. That's how deep this stuff goes. Perhaps the most amazing thing that I've learned on my entire journey of self-actualization for the last 10 or so years that I've been deliberately doing it is just how deep it goes. It never ceases to amaze me how deep it goes. My mind is getting blown every week by how deep it goes. And I can see the potential of where I'm going to be in 10 or 20 years. And it's amazing. And I know that even all of that is still not even how deep it goes. That's how deep it goes. But of course, precisely because there's so much depth to it, precisely because there's so much here that can transform your life, it's going to take a big commitment from you. It's going to take work from you. It means you can't just be lazy and you can't just sit back and listen to me casually while you're washing the dishes or while you're taking a shower or taking a shit or whatever, and then just going back to life as usual. You really got to reach a point in your life where it strikes you the significance of this, that you devote your entire life to this. This literally becomes your life. This becomes your religion, self-actualization. But not in the negative sense of religion, but in the true sense of religion. What religion was supposed to be. This is religion. Actualize.org is true religion. Which ironically is the opposite of mainstream religion. Of course, because the devil has co-opted mainstream religion. So it has to be the opposite. We talked about this in the counterintuitiveness episode. So, I encourage you to get engaged. Get engaged with life. Get engaged with living life excellently. Become a sage. Become a philosopher, for real, not as theories and ideas, not as academic pursuit, but as a way of living life. Because all you've got is this one life. What are you going to do with it? You got a better idea? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? You're going to earn money? You're going to chase sex? You're going to what? You're going to run around and join some religion and then proselytize people? What's worthwhile to do in life but this, to understand what you're supposed to be doing? How can you be doing anything when you don't know what you're supposed to be doing? And the only way you're going to figure out what you're supposed to be doing is by figuring it out. The journey and the process of figuring it out. That's what this work is.